So my talk today is going to be based on my work I've been doing for my dissertation. I did an interview study with 20 different educators, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So my talk today is entitled Web Mapping, What Are We Teaching? I apologize if it's a little rough. I'm still preparing right before this. So first, the pop quiz. How many road atlases did Rand McNally sell last year? Any guesses? Any guesses? 10,000. Come on, 10,000. All right, anyone else? A million. Anyone else? 50,000. One more? What? 5,000. Okay, the answer is, actually I have no freaking clue. But how many websites are currently embedding a Google map? This I know. What? I'm not sure that's true. No, I'm not sure it's most, but any other guesses? A million? 5 million? That's actually really close. About 4.5 million websites currently embed just a Google map. This isn't counting the leaflets or the Esris or the whatever. And then, interestingly enough, the mobile app at last count has over 1 billion active users. And that's, again, just Google. So, as an example. So my point here is, web maps are really, really important. And I feel like in our traditional cartography programs and GIS programs, we're not reaching those skills yet. At least a lot of programs don't yet have the capacity to pivot to a web focus or at least introduce web topics. So my dissertation is all about how do we teach, what do we teach and how do we teach? So in terms of web stuff. So big question number one is, are we as college educators preparing our students for the brave new world of web maps? And the second big question is, what should we be teaching? Really, two questions. What should we be teaching and how should we be teaching it? So I went out there and asked people. That was my approach. And I'll ask you to come up and talk to me about your ideas after this. All right, so here's what I did for my interview. I emailed a whole bunch of people and ended up with 22 interviews, but I ultimately eliminated 2 of them because they didn't quite meet the criteria. My criteria were the person had to be an instructor of record for a course that included teaching web mapping, included web mapping lessons on how to create web maps. So each interview was about an hour long, semi-structured. I asked all sorts of different questions about what tools and technologies people were using to teach web mapping, what pedagogies, how they, whether they were doing online instruction or in-person or a blended hybrid course, use of different kinds of resources, open, closed, what have you. And I ended up with 20 complete transcripts, and let me tell you that there's no automatic way to write a transcript when you do an interview. It's a lot of that. So anyway. So what did I ask about? These were my codes that I used to code the interviews. So there were a lot of, there were some codes that were contextual. What's the course, name of the course, what information about the program, is it a GIS program, is it cartography, master's, undergrad, etc. Statements about students, statements about the instructor's background, etc. Technologies, what tools are people using, are they open or proprietary, what's their motivation for using certain tools, what trends do they see in the marketplace, what resources they use, if they're open educational resources or if they use a textbook in class. And then the setting questions are about whether the course was taught in person or all online or some kind of hybrid. And then there were quite a bit of questions about curriculum, how whether it was organized as lecture lab or some sort of, just whole blended class, what topics were being taught, what the sort of overall goals of the course, the topics, the sequence of topics, the objectives, course outcomes, and teaching how people teach, what experiences they've had teaching, how they're challenged, what challenges they see students go through, that sort of thing. So these were all codes that I applied to statements made by my interviewees during the interview. That last one, development, is how they're developing their courses, not how you do web development. So, in order to sort of make my results a little more reliable, instead of me just saying, oh, this person, this is this code, this is that code, I used a second coder and dual coded 25% of my transcripts, so 5 of them. We went through and had someone else code, and then we compared our results. And so it wasn't bad. I got a Cohen's Kappa score of moderate, 0.5, which is moderate. It's acceptable for this sort of application. Went up to substantial agreement if I excluded the one-sided code. So that's where, say, I gave a statement a code of development or some code, and the other coder didn't give it any code. So those, take those out, it's different. Anyway, I judged these scores to be an adequate level of reliability of my results. So. All right, so what did I find? This is the big one, and I know it's possible there are a couple people in this room who I actually interviewed. I'm not sure, but regardless, this is what we all want to know, right? What are people teaching? How are they teaching it? So the first result was it takes a really, really, really long time to do qualitative data analysis, and it's still not done. So I will share with you the results I have with the caveat that I am still going through the analysis even 10 minutes before I started giving this talk. So we'll look at that a little bit. All right. So first off, the vision was the code applied to statements about the overall purpose of the course and sort of the grand scheme of the instructor's program or society as a whole. And we can see that the vast majority, the majority of interviewees, 12 out of the 20, said that their ultimate goal is to prepare students for future jobs, which seems pretty reasonable, right? We want our students to get gainfully employed. Some said they were teaching the course because the department wanted them to, it fit a need that their program had. A few people were really into, using web maps and web mapping as a route toward teaching geographic thinking or improving geospatial literacy overall. And then there's that, sort of teaching students how to make good web maps instead of bad web maps. And a few saw their courses filling a niche that I think should increasingly be not a niche, but something everyone does. So, scope describes sort of within the course as a whole, what are the range of topics covered. 9 out of the 20 interviewees, excuse me, integrated web mapping into their broader course curriculum. So the course topic was on something not specific to web mapping. So something like cartography or even some form of other geography course that taught web mapping as sort of a means to a different end. 8 people thought it was important to, had a goal of broadly exposing students to quite a few different tools. And 7 emphasized technical concepts over design concepts. So that was a lot. It's not a majority, but it's more people said they emphasized the technical concepts over design than the other way around. So I found that interesting, that we're really spending most of our time, at least more of my interviews were spending most of their time on how do we get the coding down, right? How do we get those hard skills, hard STEM skills versus the artistic aspects. And then on the sort of something that I hadn't really anticipated was a lot of people using web maps to promote critical thinking skills or bigger concepts. And that fits with that sort of, first one of web mapping being a means to a broader end. And 4 people, 20%, fifth, brought in critical theory as a key component of the course. And also a fifth of my respondents didn't have any coding or programming whatsoever in their web mapping courses. They were just using those sort of integrated platforms like ArcGIS Online. Topics, what specific topics were people teaching? A lot of it was introducing programming for the first time to geography students who didn't have any background in it. Introducing geospatial web services. A lot of people were looking at web map service and web feature service and tile services as a key component of their classes. Talking about VGI, that was a substantial portion. Cartography, of course, came in there pretty heavily, interviewing a bunch of cartographers, so hopefully we're still thinking about maps and how they look, how to access data, and then a few of the more foundational things that we kind of teach in all of our courses, all of our basics. All right, what tools were people using? So this was a really, really long list. There were 199 different technologies that my interviewees were using. And so these are just the top, of course, these are just the top ones. ArcGIS Online is king. That is the go-to platform that instructors are considering industry standard. There were a few people I interviewed who were focused mostly on the open source tools, but I'll talk a little more about that. That's not, the open source versus proprietary wasn't really a huge distinction people made, despite my asking about it. It was sort of hard to distinguish between what's proprietary and what's open source, because something like story maps, is it proprietary open source? Well, you can grab the code and modify it, but it's built by Esri, and they own the sort of the back end, so it's a tough call. Other Esri tools, of course, Esri still dominates the marketplace. Thank you. And then your basics, HTML, JavaScript. Mapbox was in there for half of them. A lot of people teaching Mapbox, and then more Esri, and then finally when we get down to 7 out of 20, not bad, are touching on Leaflet at least. Sometimes, partnering it with like Carto or Mapbox. ArcGIS Collector was an interesting one. A lot of people talked about getting students out in the field to do data collection. I'll go kind of quickly through these. Why were people teaching different types of software? Well, industry standards. And then what's interesting is complementary to that, or as many people as we're concerned about industry standards, we're concerned about variety. And so not just covering Esri, but not just covering Esri, covering other tools as well. Free tools, very important, a lot of people are teaching certain things because they're free or because they're already covered by an Esri site license. I have reduced sample size for pedagogy because I haven't finished the analysis. Lots of people, pretty much everyone did a final project as part of the class. A lot of people were giving students existing code for them to modify. Peer review was a popular, having students peer critique each other's projects was popular. Emphasis on independent troubleshooting, students going out and finding their own solutions. finding their own data, and then starting from the basics and building up. And then the biggest challenge, which I haven't, again, finished analyzing these results, but the biggest challenge was the pace of technology change and instructors not having time to keep up, not having time to do their own professional development, go to conferences, whatnot, and then time in classes to integrate, pick and choose between all these tools and concepts. It's a lot to teach. So I think it's important to balance, a few kind of conclusions. It's important to balance technical skills, geography, and critical theory. These were the three sort of big overarching motivations that came up. Industry standards versus exposure to a broad range of technologies. Again, that was a key theme, sort of key tension that people were dealing with. And then open and proprietary. Again, hard to differentiate sometimes between those two categories, and maybe they're not the best categories to sort of build an axis of, based on. They weren't really of great concern. What was of more concern was, is it free, or is it covered by my site license? Is it going to get students the skills they need? So that's all for now, but I'm happy to take a question or two if there's a minute left and talk to anyone else after the session.